Welcome to our attendees. I'm just going to take a little pause and let everybody trickle in. So, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in this on this beautiful day. My name is Kara Vincent, and I'm a knowledge translator with CIPSRT, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. And I would like to warmly welcome you to and thank you for coming to today's presentation from the Garnet Families Interactive Series. Before I pass this event along to your presenters today, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which this event is being hosted. CIPSRT acknowledges the importance of the land that we each reside upon. We do this to affirm our commitment and responsibility in honoring relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people that call this nation home. And we hope you'll join us in considering how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. A small bit of housekeeping. Please note that in today's session, attendee microphones and cameras are muted to limit background noise. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available online shortly, and you will receive an email notification once the video becomes available. There is some time set aside at the end of the presentation for audience questions. So at any time today throughout the event, you can enter your questions into the Zoom Q&A box that you'll see in your controls. This event will be presented in English with the option of simultaneous captions or audio translation in French. So I'm going to place a link in the chat that will give you instructions for accessing our translation platform. And now, with that housekeeping finished, I'm very pleased to turn the session over to Lisa Delaney with Garnet Families.
Thanks so much, Kara, and many thanks to CIPSRT for co-hosting this event with us. Thank you all for joining us today for this multidisciplinary panel discussion on the very important topic of caregiving in Garnet families. Questions about caregiving, what is known about the complexities, the consequences, the costs, the resources, and supports have really come forward from the Garnet families community, so the families as well as those who serve and support them. And so in response, we've invited these wonderful people to join us for this panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce Nora Spinks, CEO of Work Life Harmony, and Shawn Carter, Executive Director of EHN Gateway and National Director of EHN Guardian Clinical Programs, to join Dr. Heidi Cramm for the panel discussion. Thank you both, or all three of you, sorry, for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Nora to start us off.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to be just making a few remarks, and then we're going to pass it over to Shawn and then engage in some conversation. Just before I begin, I want to just touch briefly on some of the language around caregiving that we're going to be using today. A lot of material that you're going to read may be coming from the US, and when they refer to caregiving, they tend to include all parenting of all kinds within their definition of caregiving. In Canada, we tend to refer to caregiving as anything that's non-standard parenting. So it might be parenting a child with a special need, caring for adults, caring for seniors, but we tend not to include general parenting. When we talk about caregiving, we're talking about people who give care freely, often in the literature referred to as unpaid or informal care. Most caregivers dislike those labels because there's nothing informal about it, and it's not about being paid. It's about the relationship that you're in before, during, and after the care is required. So caregivers tend to be family members, close friends, whereas a care provider is somebody who provides care to a care recipient as part of their job or volunteer role and responsibility, where the relationship begins when the care is required and usually ends when it's done. And that's usually referred to as paid or formal care. We also need to consider the care recipients. They could be family members, they could be children, young adults, seniors, spouses, siblings. But care recipients can also be care recipients and be caregivers at the same time. So it's not that once you start receiving care that you no longer are in the position to provide care. Oftentimes, when we think about caregiving in Garnet families, um, it's one of those things that we tend to automatically defer to. It must be a woman caring for an older male who's injured or who's frail. And we sort of have these predetermined biases when we talk about caregiving in Garnet families, when in fact, women can be those who are providing service in the armed forces or in public safety, and men can be caregivers as well as members in the community. So I want to frame my remarks using military veteran framing, because that's where my work has been most recently, but all of what I'm talking about can be translated to all Garnet families. So the big thing about military families, so those are those who are currently serving, is that the vast majority of them now live off base in communities. So they're accessing care services and they're providing care in communities and relying on home care, transportation services, volunteer services, palliative care, whatever, delivered from community-based organizations. Many military families do have children, and veterans do have young children. But we're also, when we talk about families, we're also talking about extended families and those who may be caring for adults or seniors as well. When we talk about care, we're also talking about people who are still actively serving in their Garnet families, who may have children or spouses with special needs. And when we do talk about children with special needs, it's always challenging to find the kinds of services you need when, in particular, you're in active duty in a military family where you're relocating often. So basically, when we're talking about caregiving in Garnet families, they have all the same challenges that other families have, but then some. And it's the then some that I want to focus on today. So when we talk about caring, we're talking about caring for those young children who have special needs. We're talking about caring for a loved one that might be around childbirth or illness or injury or some kind of cancer care or chronic illness, disability. It may be a substance use, caring for an aging parent because of a fall, because of a chronic illness or dementia, caring for an aging parent that may be living in close proximity or may be living at long distances. But unique to Garnet families, there's also a cadre that care for each other. And this is particularly true for women veterans, but it's also true for Garnet families, where you have to understand the culture, the history, the experiences in order to provide care. So caring for a peer. And then there's caring for self. And we know that this is the one thing that everybody talks about is critically important for caregivers. But it is really challenging for people in Garnet families because they're the ones who provide the care. They're the ones who provide the safety and the security and the response. And they tend to put themselves last. Identifying needs or reaching out isn't something that comes naturally to this group. When we talk about care, there's three major components that we talk about: the intensity of the care, the duration, and how much control or predictability there is. So something like dementia, you have a pretty good idea it's going to be long term. It's going to increase in intensity over time until maybe there's an abrupt change when your loved one goes into long-term care, but you can sort of predict where things are going. Alternatively, it might be a mental illness, which is episodic. You know there's going to be another episode, but you don't know exactly when, and you don't know exactly how long that episode is going to be. So when we talk about caregiving, we need to factor in these three dimensions. When we talk about care, we're talking about a lot of care. When we look just at veterans, 70% of veteran caregivers give more than 30%, and of those, a quarter of them are over 100 hours a week. And so when we're talking about care, we're talking about really intensive care over the course of a week, over the course of a year, over the course of a career. Um, I'm not going to get too much into this. This is something that Heidi's the expert in. But when we look at Garnet families, it really is about the risk, the mobility, the logistics, and the identity when we're talking about caregiving. There's not been a lot of research done on caregiving. There's been a lot on parenting, on illness and injury, but not a lot through the lens of care. So what we do know is that the complexity increases as you move into Garnet families. Oftentimes people are far away from their supports, from family, from friends, and finding, accessing, and navigating healthcare systems, services systems is challenging and often has to be repeated over the course of a career in multiple jurisdictions. As I mentioned, self-care, which is critically important to making all these pieces work well, is really antithetical to military culture and Garnet families. Caregiving, like all caregiving, is rewarding and fulfilling and life enriching. It can also be demanding, exhausting, and isolating. So as we talk about what we need to think about when we're thinking about Garnet families and caregiving, we need to recognize that this is two sides of the same coin. Because a lot of people within the Garnet families community are men, we need to recognize that most men rarely consider themselves a caregiver. Their sons, their husbands, their fathers, their colleagues, they rarely identify as a caregiver. As I mentioned earlier, you can be giving and receiving care at the same time. And there are lots of jurisdictional, legal limitations with respect to how services and supports are accessed. But I do want to share with you just a couple of examples of services that are available right now in the veteran community that we can use as models outside of the veteran community. One is a relatively new caregiver recognition benefit that provides funds for those who qualify as caregivers who are identified by the care recipient. If you're eligible, you can receive around $1,200 a month to offset the out-of-pocket costs. Oftentimes we hear about the VIP or Veterans Independence Program, and that covers, again, for those that qualify, up to $13,500 per year to allow people to remain in their own homes as they age. There's psychological services and there's operational stress injury resources. There's also new resources out of military family resource centers that are available for caregivers. And so we're now beginning to see people recognizing as they are outside of Garnet families that caregivers provide the vast majority of care when anybody needs it. And the stresses and strains on them include the physical, the emotional, the financial, and it impacts their well being and their ability to continue to provide care. So that's just sort of a rough overview of some of the things to think about when we engage in conversation about caregiving in Garnet families. You can always reach me if you have any information, and we'll make sure that you have available this list of resources and also the references if you're interested in looking at it from that perspective. So very happy to engage in conversation, and I will stop now and pass it over to Shawn.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nora. I especially loved kind of the practical programs and benefits you listed at the end. It's always good to remind ourselves of what exists out there to support. I will give Lisa just a moment. I believe she'll be sharing the screen, so I'll just give her a moment. But there we go. So my name's Shawn Carter, and I join you today wearing a few hats, as most of us often do. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years working as a clinician, a behavior therapist in particular, with various different populations, but I've always been drawn and passionate about family work, and have seen firsthand sort of the impact that caregiving has on folks. At EHN Guardians Gateway, which is an inpatient treatment facility for military veterans and public safety personnel, we see that firsthand impact of the work that these folks do on Garnet families. This work has led to some research that I'm doing under Dr. Heidi Cramm, who's here with us today too, at Queen's University, where we're currently doing interviews trying to understand the experiences of spouses and significant others of our clients during inpatient treatment. So what we find is that inpatient treatment, that inpatient lens allows us to see the impact on caregivers in some pretty unique and nuanced ways that are much more specific than some of the ones that Nora spoke to. And some of those include even just prior to admission to treatment, when a loved one is struggling, Garnet families become often de facto caregivers. They're managing the home, regulating conflict at home, absorbing stress of the family, and that this caregiving usually starts early, as Nora mentioned. This is typically long-standing periods of caregiving that are needed, and usually long before formal help is accessed. And this often continues long after treatment ends as well. We also see that there's this sort of shift in caregiving roles during intensive treatment. So when the loved one enters treatment, caregivers experience mixed emotions. There's sometimes this relief that, for a moment, I don't have to sort of bear the burden of all that caregiving, even just for a short period of time. Typically, folks are in treatment anywhere from 7 to 9 weeks. So there can be a relief in sharing that responsibility with the treatment provider, but there can also be a lot of anxiety, sometimes feelings of loss of control, guilt, or concern about how to support their loved one from afar, and in many cases, their children at the same time. There can also be anticipatory worry or stress about the return home. So as discharge approaches, families worry about what that return will look like and whether they'll be ready. We hear lots of stories of people who, expect that their loved one is going to be sort of forever changed by the inpatient experience, and that maybe that caregiving in return will be forever changed. And then others kind of report that the changes aren't as observable as they had hoped, and that there isn't much change in caregiving. So these are really complex kinds of scenarios. From an inpatient, sorry, there's what we also see on the inpatient side is that there's the impact of the absence itself during that inpatient experience. We actually completed a recent study at EHN Guardians Gateway, which highlighted kind of four main impacts on caregivers. And this was from this perspective. This was from the perspective of the service users themselves, so our military veteran, public safety personnel who are receiving treatment. But they really highlighted a lot of really important pieces about the impact on caregivers. The first that they highlighted was when military veterans or first responders are away, whether it could be for operational duties or for something like inpatient treatment, that their families face significant challenges, and that absence isn't just physical. It disrupts the way they described it was disrupting the emotional fabric of the household, leaving loved ones to manage both the practical tasks but also the emotional support roles at the same time. The second kind of main finding that was shared with us was that caregivers often have to take on additional responsibilities. So from just managing kind of the practical tasks like household tasks, managing and supporting children and all the extracurriculars sometimes that go along with that, things like finances. But while in treatment, many clients actually I think they start to realize and they voice that they're starting to recognize the weight that their loved ones are carrying during their illness, prior to treatment and during treatment. The third, and this ties really, really nicely to the mobility dimension of Garnet families that Nora mentioned, but the long distances between treatment facilities and home can make it even harder for families to stay connected and feel supported. At EHN, often clients are coming from all over the country, which can really amplify the added weight on caregivers at home. And that the separation really limits the ability of caregivers to access help or maintain routines, which increases the strain on those at home. Lastly, and not least importantly, the emotional impact is especially pronounced in cases where there may be children involved who often are struggling to even understand why their parent is away, and that the remaining parent is left then responsible for supporting children through these challenging and confusing times. So it's just that really highlights sort of the layered aspect of caregiving, that there could have been caregiving happening for the loved one who needed treatment, but then there's also this shift in caregiving for those left at home who are potentially supporting children or other family members with just even understanding sort of what is going on. And partners often report feelings of loneliness, emotional overload, and concern for the well-being of their loved one, highlighting kind of that deep interdependence within family systems. So what we find, while it gives us a window into some of these struggles, we also feel as though intensive treatment, like inpatient treatment, offers a unique opportunity to help family members discover potential methods for self-care. That breather may allow for the exploring of different strategies that may help them. It could facilitate connection also with people facing similar situations or fostering a sense of being cared for. So I'll leave you with kind of a couple thoughts before we move on to Heidi and our discussion. But while we continue to forge ahead with advancing mental health treatment for military veterans and public safety personnel, I think we can all recognize that there's a ton more work to be done to support their families. I was actually having a recent conversation with a family member of someone who was here in treatment, and they allowed me to share this quote, that they are always caring for and never cared for. And while caregivers can at times be recipients of care, as Nora highlighted, many don't actually get that opportunity to receive the care that they need. And I really feel strongly, and I know those here joining feel strongly that this should serve as a call to action for us to do better. For us to recognize the complex worlds faced by these caregivers and find ways to support them better. Thank you.
Well, so much to think about, so much to talk about. I think that it's been really helpful to have such a grounded kind of context for the language. So I appreciate Nora taking the time to kind of lay that out. And then Shawn, I think this recent experience and the ongoing work that you're doing around trying to understand this kind of care ecosystem within EHN provides us with some natural kind of jumping off points for sure. One of the things that kind of occurs to me when we think about care and care provision and receiving care, and I think that, Nora, you really got into this, is that it's the then some. I like that phrasing. So this kind of amplification of these elements of how to create a care system that isn't just kind of depleting one side of the system, but can sustain itself, and that there are these lifestyle dimensions that go along with being a Garnet family member can really amplify some of the demands of care, create limitations on access to care services, disruption of care, and a limitation around care for self. I think it's a really great way to kind of think it all the way through. I'm going to add in one element of care that I didn't hear, and it's around pets, because pets add a whole other layer of, when you think about shift work and you think about people being away, is how do you manage pets are in that mix? And when we think about families and all kinds of families, is that sometimes it's not kids, it's not elders, it's actually pets in people's family systems, and that pets really do play a really important role within family around well-being and care. Um, so I, just kind of add that in our, sense of families. But one of the things that really I wanted to kind of come back to is, just before we get into the kind of risk element, is the logistics of care. So I think this is one of the things that we're trying to do with the Garnet families kind of discussions, is that it's not all about risk. It's not all about kind of worst case scenario. There's just, the lifestyle. There are issues here with logistics and mobility, this kind of disruption of care. So just wondering if either of you want to kind of kick off with how logistics really plays out differently in these kinds of families.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think the first thing that families are struggling with is finding and then securing and then managing care relationships, whether it's a service provider in the community or whether they're purchasing their own respite care. Every province, every community is a little bit different, but just keeping track. We've heard from families about binders that they keep, about shared files that they keep with their siblings, where there's like a calendar of every hour of a day and who's getting what medication and who's getting what therapy and who's getting what appointments, and just managing and organizing all of that. And oftentimes what we find is that, especially families that are quite isolated, oftentimes it's the children in the family that are drawn into the caregiving role. So they're either helping out around the house, they're helping to keep things organized, they're helping to keep their own school requirements sort of organized themselves so that they're not putting extra demands on parents, that they're becoming almost the conduit between community services and family members. So we have to think very carefully about that. And the second thing I think is, as you mentioned, with all this shift work and long periods of time alone, there's a lot of skills that are developed as a result of this sort of serial single parenting, or long periods of time alone where you got to figure things out, or you're up in the middle of the night and there's nobody to sort of give you the reassurances that you're doing the best you can with the information you have, you've got the resources, you're going to be okay. Those kinds of reassurances you don't have when you're working shift or when you're in isolated communities. So I think those are two of the things that sort of contribute to the emotional load, that's part of the logistics. And if you're new to an area, you don't even know where to look to find what's available. And not all, especially small communities, are list all their services on the internet. You can't always find, who's available to help drive my loved one to their treatment facility, or me to visit them. So I think just finding, securing, managing, and keeping all the paper and the records together is huge.
Absolutely. And I think that when we think about military families, there may be points of contact within military family resource centers where there may be more of that kind of social organization of where to go for some of these services. There may be some of those accesses to veteran families as well. I don't think the same services are necessarily available for public safety families in the same kind of organized way. So that's kind of on the logistics end. And then there's the logistics of care when you have something, like the family's separating for a period of time for intensive care. So, Shawn, can you speak more to kind of what you're hearing from folks about, what it takes to deal with the logistics of, well, now he or she is away, and now I'm left to sort this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I maybe naively set out when I was sort of thinking about, what might this study sort of find. Of course, it's easy to sort of see that there would be emotional and logistical impacts. I think what's starting to come to light is how much those two things are interconnected. That what we
Hmm.
see is that it isn't just as simple as this great emotional impact or all of these logistical tasks that maybe existed even prior to the admission, but even during the admission, is that if there's this great emotional load that's coming, and this impact of and the weight of that absence of the person being away from the home, that makes it actually much harder to tend to the logistical things that are needed. And if it's overwhelming to tend to the logistical things, it adds to sort of the psychological weight of that absence. And I guess the naive part was that not maybe recognizing how interconnected those things are, and how much that is sort of compounded and exacerbated in a situation where someone has left the home. And while there may have been a lot of caregiving tasks that led to a lot of sort of bearing of that load, even when the person was home, I think there's suddenly now, oh, I have to worry about mowing the lawn. I have to I have to do every hockey drive. I have to, take their parents, like, their in-laws now. I have to be the one to take them to appointments. And so knowing that the logistical sort of tasks just mount during that time really presents some pretty significant impacts also on the psychological side of things as well.
And I would just
Well,
add that, one of the things that happens is you then end up going to the hockey arena or the daycare center or the local pediatrician, um, and they have no idea what you're going through. And the lack of awareness and understanding of the nature of life in a Garnet family really begins to show when their expectations, like, hey, can you volunteer for the bake sale before the holiday season? It's like, one more thing. No, I can't. Like, don't even ask me to take on something new. And don't question my commitment to my children or their school or the holiday season by me saying, no, I am at capacity. I am managing this alone, and please don't add any more layers. And that lack of awareness and understanding isn't because they don't want to know. It's that nobody's ever given them the opportunity to learn about these unique features and experiences of Garnet families that many of them have coming through their doors anyway, whether it's a
mhm.
clinic or a hospital or a home care service or a respite care service. There's just this big void that needs to be filled to help these community services understand that this isn't your typical family dealing with these situations, but it's amplified and magnified and then some.
If I can add as well, Heidi, if that's okay, not to jump in, but
Hmm.
around stigma, and there's the lack of awareness in the community. I completely agree, and there's this added layer of being afraid to tell people. If I'm looking at it from an inpatient standpoint, I'm actually just sometimes afraid to tell anyone in my
Hmm.
circle that that's where my loved one is, which really sort of narrows the opportunity to get that support and seek that support when I'm actually scared to tell people where my loved one even is. And so that sphere of support can often shrink even more than maybe it's already shrunk because the person's not working during that time, and they don't have access to the
Hmm.
supports that come with kind of the workplace. So it's clearly a very layered, complex situation.
Or or sometimes feeling guilty that you're actually relieved that they're gone. And that it's sometimes easier to manage when you're making all the decisions and you don't have to consult with anybody and you know they're taken care of. And now you're actually feeling a whole lot better. And then you feel guilty for feeling better that they're not here. And so the layers and layers and layers start to get really heavy.
Well, and I think some of these layers actually speak to that sense of identity and who you are within the occupational community, and maybe not wanting it to be known within the occupational community, and then within the broader community, even more so, feeling that kind of sense of I can't share, I can't tell. And I think, I've talked to each of you about this before. When I started doing this research work, like way back when, like 10 years ago, and we were doing that first study on PTSD and military veteran families, and really just kind of like what's out there, what is known. And I was doing it old school. I was carrying around these like 47 articles. And I'm like reading them and just fully digesting them. And my colleague in the hallway at Queen's, her husband had been diagnosed with cancer, and she put up a calendar when he was having his different treatments, and that communicated to everybody when she would have, more capacity, less capacity, might need, like, hey, how you doing? Like, do you need anything? Can I bring you this? Can I bring you that? And all I could think about was, what would the calendar look like for a family member whose spouse, was diagnosed with PTSD? How could you put that calendar up? And there's no casserole coming for you, right, as a spouse in that kind of scenario. So the juxtaposition of these two scenarios was just so profound for me. Like, it's really stuck with me in just how the experience is so different. And I don't think things have changed much in 10 years around that, except I think there are more treatment options. But I don't think that sense of that isolation, and Shawn, I think you talked about that emotional and logistical combination. There's so many layers of feelings around providing care. What is the nature of the relationship with the care recipient? Is there reciprocal care? Is it one-sided care? Does it feel heavy? Does it feel rewarding? Like, there's so many pieces there that people will experience at a very personal way. And I think the sense of, bandwidth gets so reduced. And then when people go into, say, a residential or intensive treatment experience, and the family member and the family as a whole is not really getting that service, you start to get an imbalance of, the system kind of gets out of whack, in the idea that you want it to get into a different state post-treatment, but you're only really kind of caring for one side of the system, and the rest of the system is trying to care for itself at a time when it's been quite depleted, because no one goes in. I don't think anyone really goes into inpatient kind of, residential treatment unless they really need it.
Well, one of the programs I'm involved with is Eggshells, which is a program for veterans who are impacted by loved one's substance use. And what we're finding there is that people are looking for their own care. Once they find care for their loved one, wherever that happens to be, so they've gone off to Shawn's program, then what about me? And what about my own mental health? The good news is, unlike 10 years ago, where there was even more stigma than there is today, there's a little bit more mental health and mental well-being literacy. So people know what language to use to sort of share what they're going through. There's still lots of fear and guilt and anxiety and concern that if they seek help, then somebody might find out. So there's still stigma and fear that they will be judged, or their loved ones' opportunities for advancement or career implications are too high. So I'm just going to suffer in silence and hope that this is going to get better on its own, because I can't risk So I think there's this sort of combination of more acceptance and understanding of mental health and mental illness and mental well-being and mental health literacy with this sort of layered on fear, occupational fear, and then
Yeah.
community fear of judgment. And these are people that are supposed to be strong and, resourceful and courageous. And all of a sudden now they need care. And so how does that impact their own identity and their own willingness and ability to seek, accept, and receive help?
Absolutely. Shawn, any thoughts from you on?
I mean, other than really agreeing with everything Nora just said, I think there's this thing that we notice, and I think Nora spoke to it, and I think you spoke to it as well, Heidi, is that often when someone is pushed to the point where they feel like, okay, now's the time, I need this type of intensive treatment, as you said, they're typically at their worst, and they're not only at their worst, the whole family system is at their worst, and so the focus becomes the help is here provided to the individual who obviously needs it, who needs, there's no question that they
Mm-hmm.
need that support. But then there's the family left sometimes for weeks at a time, with no information other than what's coming from their loved ones. So I think it really speaks to the importance of taking information we learn from the voices of loved ones of Garnet families in these more unique circumstances, and developing programs that
Mm-hmm.
really kind of address it in a way that isn't just making an assumption that, okay, you need logistical help or you need someone else to talk to who's been through it. Sometimes what they may need is access to a psychotherapist, someone who can actually do therapy with them that is focused on their needs, not always just on the needs of the person who served in the military or protected our communities in a public safety role. So I think that's hope. We're really hoping that is what this research sort of highlights is
Yeah.
allows them to kind of share exactly what they think are the things they need during that really unique time frame.
But I think that what's lacking is the family lens. So we have care and services and support for the military member, the veteran, the public safety person, um, without a family lens
Mm-hmm.
or without sort of the jurisdictional capacity to serve the family or use a family lens in creating those services and supports, things fall short. So, for example, the caregiver recognition benefit that I described. If
Mm-hmm.
I'm a loved one looking after a veteran, I'm eligible. I was talking to a gentleman a couple weeks ago. He's a veteran. He's looking after his wife who has ALS. He's not eligible as a caregiver. She's only eligible as the caregiver. He has to be the care receiver. So we've got these great programs, but without a family lens, we're not able to um, meet the needs as they present themselves. And just to circle back, Heidi, to what you were saying about the calendar about cancer care, there isn't yet in our communities the openness, the willingness, the capacity to say, hey, my loved one's not going through chemotherapy, they're going through residential treatment for a substance use disorder or for a mental health treatment. And I'm alone for the next 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 16 weeks. Cut me some slack. Or I need help with getting the kids from point A to point B or mother-in-law to appointments. Um, so we're still a ways away. I think we've come a
Yeah.
long way in a decade, but we're not there yet. And I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that we're on the right path and having
Mm-hmm.
these kinds of conversations about the significance of caregiving and everybody understanding how vitally important caregivers are to the health and well-being of not only those who are serving, but for the circle of support around those who are serving in the short term and the long term. And that it's not just in the moment that somebody needs care and assistance, but it's throughout their lifetime. And that whole intensity and duration, we need to really understand that in order to figure out how best to support families, because there's intensity as you're getting somebody ready to go into residential treatment. And then there's sort of less intensity with that person, but maybe more intensity for other family members. And then when the family reunites, there's all kinds of intensity and tension, and not all of that's predictable. But cancer, you know that there's a cycle, and you know that there's so many treatments of chemotherapy and so many weeks of radiation, and you might not always know what the prognosis is going to be, but you've got at least 10 weeks ahead, you know what your schedule is going to be.
You do have some anchors on how to on what to expect, how people are going to react. Like, there are parameters and people can talk about those things in a way that we're not. I think the intensity, duration, and control elements of care are really important because it's not just, a defined thing. That variability in the experience, whether it's positive or negative, I think is a really important thing. And some of that comes down to the nature of the relationship, as you say, the kind of like what was the relationship before care, during care, after care, this kind of life course, career life course, and family life course, they all braid together. And sometimes they knot up. And they're these like, sticky bits that kind of happen with that deep interdependence, I think, that you talked about, Shawn. I do think that I want to spend a couple of minutes on just the policy programmatic development stuff before I can see that there's at least one comment in the Q&A, and we invite others that will take a couple of minutes to try and get to. When we have a person-focused lens, which is how these things are structured, how a healthcare system is structured, how, getting, revenue to support healthcare delivery is individually based. So that family lens really kind of challenges that, because we start to look at the person in their family and what that looks like and how we can actually expect to see gains when we look beyond individual. Like Candace Monson always talks about how couples therapy is individual therapy. So that kind of system level give and take does matter. But sometimes the eligibility for care changes in relation to the status to the person who serves or who had served. So I think it gets complicated sometimes for family members to even get the care that they need, which, Nora, you have a great example. I'll give an example from work I recently finished with the Surviving Families program with Wounded Warriors when I did the program evaluation. And for people who are bereaved, the logistics of trying to manage, trying to leave their children for the first time since they lost their spouse, that was such a significant element, and the kind of sense of isolation to be able to go and spend time in that kind of care recovery, care of self, to be able to then go back and continue to provide care for the children, because for many of them, it had been several years since the passing of their loved one, their family member, and really that had been their only attention. So, Nora, when you laid out the 5 different ways in which, care can look, I think that care of children is often the most central. And so that care of self is like all the way over at number 5. And it goes back to that, the ad on the plane of, if you need oxygen, where do you go? But it's easier said than done, because we are absolutely wired to provide care for others when we're in these families. There's no question about it. It's very hard to carve out a structured routine because of the logistics of the lifestyle to actually do that in a consistent way, I think. Yeah.
No, I agree. I think what is really interesting when you look at sort of the evolution of this space and our understanding about care and caregiving, you know, it wasn't that long ago that it was the Garnet member, so the military member, the veteran, the public safety person, and their family. So family
Mm-hmm.
was sort of tagged on. And then it was veterans and veteran families. And veteran families were started to be seen as a separate entity in and of
Mm-hmm.
themselves, deserving care and needing it. And I love what's sort of coming now, and Heidi, in some of your work, you're sort of driving this new narrative, which is the veteran in a family. And
Mm-hmm.
that requires the family lens. And that
Mm-hmm. Sure
means you
does.
have to
Yeah.
look at every intervention has a ripple, positive and negative. And if we start looking at these people in families, in communities, in occupations, in society, in the economy, then all of a sudden it changes the way in which we provide support, the way in which people can seek or receive care. It
Mm-hmm.
changes the language and the dialogue around families. And it's not that they're needy, it's that they're human. And all of a sudden, we can provide human services and support and assistance without judgment, without stigma, without shame, without guilt. And it impacts the individual's well being, the couple's well being, the family's well being. And they can take that from community to community. You throw in
Absolutely.
complexities like autism or children who are struggling in school or kids who are being bullied, all of that sort of disrupts the flow. But if we look at these families in community, then we can start creating programs and services. So if you're in Gagetown 1 month and Cold Lake, Alberta the next, and you have that child with autism, you know you're going to get exactly the same care in one location as the other, in one community and the other. And once we start working through family systems within community systems, it changes the way in which we respond, we react, we support, we serve, and the way in which families ultimately will will feel the difference.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Absolutely.
just recognizing this brought up just the sheer sort of diversity of families that exist in Canada and the world, but really recognizing that not every family is sort of the traditional family that we would consider to be, where there's a partner at home with children, and that these could be much older people who maybe their children have left the home, maybe they never had children, maybe they're single
Mm-hmm.
and their family are extended family members, and that all of the people in those circles deserve the same level of care and the same support, no matter what. But it just, whether that diversity comes from sort of the struggle that the caregiving is required for, like autism,
Mm-hmm.
that or medical condition, or recognizing that it's often bigger than just sort of that family who's living in the home, and that there's other people involved as well.
But there's also history, right? There's also a history. We all have history in families. I was at a dinner the other day, and this woman goes, "Oh, there are some people who say family is everything. Ugh, they haven't experienced life in my family. My family is not everything. It's a headache." And she just went on a rant about don't use that word. It's a horrible word. And so I think we need to be
Mm-hmm.
aware and open and understanding that everybody defines family their own way. And the best definition of family I've ever heard is that family is where you learn to get along with people that don't share your interests, and you learn about the process of aging and illness. So I think we need to, when we have these conversations, recognize that not everybody has what would typically be considered a family or a family unit. And a lot of people within the Garnet community, really it's their peers that are the ones that they provide care to and that they receive care from. So when we look at caregiving, and care providing and care receiving, I think we need to look at this with a very holistic, warm, welcoming, inclusive, and continuously learning opportunity for all of us.
Thanks to you both. I'm just going to acknowledge that in the Q&A, we've got some very valid comments about if the partner, oh no, wrong one, sorry. When a member retires or medical releases and relocates, help is not as readily available, and trying to seek help can be challenging. 100%, we would validate that experience. And it's really, it has to be, some of the MFRCs are now providing more access on some of the veteran friendly kind of programs. And then there are a few things there also that we will send out around eggshells and how to access eggshells, which is funded through Veterans Affairs, but is run through groups that Nora's connected with. So we will be able to share that stuff out. And Lisa, I see that you're here as kind of our timekeeper and bringing up the rear on housekeeping. So over to you.
Yes, thank you. Such a valuable conversation. I think every event I'm at, I receive questions about whether it's implicitly or kind of comes in the back door of questions of this is what I'm doing right now. This is what I'm experiencing. And it is challenging. It is isolating. What do you know? Where are the resources? Where are the supports? So I think shedding the light that we see these families, that we see these carers, we see the caregivers, the care receivers, and recognize that there's a lot more work to be done, but there has been a lot of work, and sharing out that knowledge was really valuable today. So thank you all. I have a slide here just of some resources, and then we'll compile them along with Nora's resources, produce an infographic bilingual to make sure everyone receives the information that they need. And another way really to stay up to date with us is to connect with Garnet families through our social media, through our website. You can send us a question, and we are happy and always there to respond, as well as subscribe to our mailing list. That's where we share out the most recent knowledge, resources, research, to keep everybody up to date on these types of topics. So there will be in just a minute after the event a post-event survey that comes out to all of you. And that's also really important to us because that's where we get these important topics. And so that's how we continue to respond to the needs and gaps. And so please, it's really short, just a few minutes, but we really do read through all of them and value your opinion that you share with us and your needs. So again, a massive thank you to all of you. And I just wanted to zoom through that to leave space for Nora, Shawn, and Heidi, if you have any final thoughts that you didn't get to share that you're percolating on that you want to do before we sign off.
You got 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Nora?
Just keep the conversation happening. Reach out. Thoughts, ideas, always welcome. We are working with the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence on a national caregiving strategy, and there is an element for military veteran families in there. If you're interested in learning more about that, the conversation is ongoing. Just keep the questions coming. Thanks.
Shawn? Thanks, Nora.
No, again, specific to kind of inpatient treatment, if you know someone whose loved one is in treatment, just ask them what they may need. Just leave it open and don't assume what they may need or don't assume that they don't want to talk about it. Just offer that help, whatever that help may look like for that individual.
Ask if you can bring a casserole or some
Sure.
other meal.
Or take their dog for a walk. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Here you go.
And thanks
So
to SIPSRT and Garnet families for bringing this topic to this forum. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.